Welcome back to U.S. History. Today we're talking about an age of reform. It's part 2 of chapter 12. Now, what did we learn about in the last time that sort of leads to this age of reform? I'll give you a hint. The Second Great Awakening, okay? How do I know if you're partaking in the Second Great Awakening? Well, you'll be a part of the temperance movement, which is reducing alcohol. You'll also be a part of the abolitionist movement. Well, some of these women, let's get into this here. Some of these women are going to be fighting for the rights for African Americans, the right to vote per se, and they don't themselves have the right to vote. So they're fighting for these rights and they go, wait a second, we don't have these rights. And so from the Second Great Awakening, you get the abolitionist movement, and from the abolitionist movement, you get the women's rights movement. So I want you to see how all of those things tie in. Seneca Falls, that's an important location for the women's rights movement. And then we'll talk about transcendentalism, which means a return to nature. If you remember, we had the Industrial Revolution, and so there's more machines, and there's more just automation, people having to work for the clock and work at a factory. And so people want to get off the grid, people want to escape the machine, and they're gonna go back to nature, okay? If you need to pause this slide to write this down, you can. All right, what's the connection between the abolitionist movement and women's rights movement? We just talked about that. Okay, women will be fighting for the rights for African Americans to vote, and then they're gonna say, what about us? We should get to vote too. What was Seneca Falls? A meeting to advance women's rights. And what is transcendentalism? Going back to nature. Understand why people want to go back to nature. Okay? You don't have to write this down, but take a look. When we say rights, we always think of voting, but there's more than just that. There's political, economic, and legal rights, such as you're not allowed to vote, or a woman's not allowed to sit on a jury, or really go to college, be a doctor or lawyer. You can't own property, and you can't keep your wages. So your husband would get your money, basically. So again, we mentioned it just a second ago, but it needs to get in there. Abolitionist women are fighting for freedom and social reforms, and then they fight for their own freedom as well. So hopefully you understand the link between those two movements. Okay, this one you do need to write down. Seneca Falls, make sure you have that in your notes. And then of all the different leaders there, I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton is probably the most important. So make sure you know some of these women's rights leaders. There's Seneca Falls on the map. Okay, what is Seneca Falls? The Seneca Falls Convention, what is that? Okay, a meeting to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. Exactly. And what's going to be one of their demands? The right to vote. And if you look, it takes, 72 years or so from the convention to the 19th Amendment when women get the right to vote. All right.
Last month marked the 167th anniversary of the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. WENY's Natalie Abruzzo is live in the studio to tell us more about the birthplace of the women's rights movement. Natalie?
Yes, Ross, it's known as the birthplace of the women's rights movement, but Seneca Falls is not only a thriving town, it's a national treasure.
This is the start of the biggest social movement in American history. This is the place where half the American population met for the first time to fight for their rights. So this is a very exciting place to be.
Stenshorn is referring to the Women's Rights Convention of 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. 300 people attended the convention, both men and women, and it's where the Declaration of Sentiments was drafted and adopted, outlining resolutions crucial to women's equality.
It lists all of the demands and rights that women are going to fight for within the women's rights movement, and it is basically a version of the Declaration of Independence, but changed to reflect women's issues rather than colonial American issues.
Drafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at a planning session in the parlor of Mary Ann McClintock's house, the original table now resides at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And the Wesleyan Chapel, where the convention was held, went through several owners. It was last operated as a laundromat before becoming a national park and historic site in 1985. And even though it would take 72 years from the time of that convention until the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote was passed, that didn't stop great women throughout our history from accomplishing great things. Just down the road from the site of the first Women's Rights Convention is the National Women's Hall of Fame, honoring over 256 great women of American history, from Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt to Harriet Tubman and Elmira native astronaut Eileen Collins.
It is incredibly important for our society to understand that women are contributors and important contributors to the growth of our country and the growth of our economy and the growth of our social life and our culture.
Startling statistics show that only 10% of content in U.S. history books is about women. And students can't name 20 women in history that aren't athletes, celebrities, or first ladies. The Hall is working to change that through its public induction process and its proposed new location at the Knitting Mill. The location is slated to become a state-of-the-art educational venue telling the stories of great American women.
So this mill has significance to Seneca Falls on many levels. They were abolitionists, they were women's rights activists, they were human rights activists. So we have a special bond with this site and are thrilled that this will become the home of the National Women's Hall of Fame.
All right, so make sure you understand, what is the women's rights movement? It's an effort to improve. Yeah, voting is a good one to remember, but don't forget about the political, economic, and legal rights as well. Okay, so here are some fun facts. In 1860, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton get New York to pass a law protecting property rights for women. And then let's talk about education. If a woman's place is in the home, then why do they need to learn math and science? Well, Troy Female Seminary is the first school that teaches women subjects such as science. So make sure you know that. That's a little test question. Here's some fun facts. First woman elected to the Academy of Arts, American Academy of Arts of Sciences, 1848. And then Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman to graduate from an American medical school. All right, now we're talking about transcendentalism, okay? Big word that just is describing people wanting to go back to nature. So we've had this industrial revolution, and now people are criticizing or at least analyzing. We have all these goods, but we don't have craftsmen. The quality of the good has gone down. It's mass-produced items. Henry David Thoreau goes to Walden Pond and lives there for a few years. People just want to get away from the machine and kind of go back to a simpler time. Now we're going to talk about culture, and this is important. Before I get into some definitions, let's look at what culture is. Music, books, movie, fashion, jargon, slang. Okay, what you wear, what's your favorite song, what's your favorite movie? This is all a product of culture. If you were born in another country, what if you were born in Brazil? Would your favorite song still be your favorite song? A different song might be your favorite song. If you had a different culture around you and you spoke a different language, or you were raised with different foods, these things would be part of you. And so it's interesting to see how you come together with your culture. American culture, I would say, is the dominant culture right now because most of the world knows Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, etc. You might not know what the #1 movie is in India or Indonesia or something like that. And so I just want you to see that culture it's part of a program. It might be too strong to say indoctrination, but we all have these shared values. And so the reason I bring this up is because at this point in history, America is leaving behind English culture, and they're really establishing firmly American culture, which will shape the next 100 to 200 years of growth. So we look at these books real quick, Moby Dick, Scarlet Letter, Little Women. Most people have to read these at some point in their school. I had to read Scarlet Letter, but you should probably be familiar with them. Look at these paintings. What's important to America or Americans? Getting together, nature, outdoors, something along those lines. So these are cool American paintings. Now here's a quick song for you.
Hey, come on, Johnny, sing us a song!
Camptown gals all sing a song, doo-dah, doo-dah. Camptown racetrack 10 miles long, oh, doo-dah day. 15 men on the Camptown track, doo-dah, doo-dah, trying to hold that bay horse back, oh, doo-dah day. Bound to run all night, bound to run all day. I bet my money on a bobtail nag, somebody bet on the bay.
All right, so we're going to finish out with this. What's your favorite guitar? Chances are you picked the one that looks like what we would call a regular guitar. But if you grew up somewhere else, maybe you like a different guitar. How do you know what's your favorite guitar if you haven't heard the other ones or if you haven't heard them as much? Does that make sense? So it's just kind of interesting. I just wanted you to kind of think about culture and how it influences you. Today, you learned the link between the Second Great Awakening and the abolitionist movement, and the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. Okay, very good. And what's the key event or place where the women's rights movement takes place? Seneca Falls. Can you name one key women's rights leader? Can you? Go ahead and look at the notes. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You got it. All right, excellent. We'll see you back here real soon.